It's really that we're in a new environment. I mean, it's been progressive, obviously, over a period of time, but this is a time of constraint, certainly at the fiscal level. And I think that that is driving changes in policy perspectives, MAP 21, and it continued federal funding at levels consistent with those under the predecessor act, Safety Lou. And that can be seen as a positive. I think people were just thrilled that program levels were maintained. But again, policy was stagnant funding, try to maintain things, to maintain funding levels. There were, I think, very substantial and significant reforms in MAP 21. So I would say that we're actually in a period of change despite the stagnation in federal funding. It's a period of change in identifying the federal role, the extent of the federal role in surface transportation, and also the character or nature of it. As I said, changes in national transportation policy are occurring, though they're incremental and often unspoken and even unrecognized by the authorizing environment. While the public does not seem to recognize or seems generally unwilling to pay to restore the nation's so-called described crumbling infrastructure, the American public seems to accept these conditions, maybe complain about them, but accept them as if it were the weather, in lieu of supporting higher federal gasoline taxes or new sorts of user fees to invest in these facilities. Now, there are many reasons, I think, for this resistance to greater funding for transportation at the federal level. Of course, one is a general distrust of government and a lack of faith that new revenues will in fact be invested in the facilities that will actually improve the particular circumstances of transportation users or consumers. I think that's one of the reasons that generally we've seen more success at the state and metropolitan levels in getting some revenue increases, new bonds, for example, because they tend to be tied to specific projects, and people can see that connection, because people can connect them to the things that they see, and they can believe that the government will actually carry out the things promised. That is hard to do at the federal level, and crumbling infrastructure really doesn't do it. People seem unwilling to support burdening themselves further in tough economic times. And the result, as I said, is that federal surface transportation funding is stagnant. By the end of MAP 21, September 30, 2014, almost $55 billion of general funds will have to have been transferred to the Highway Trust Fund. And the Congressional Budget Office has said that such transfers may not be adequate to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent. Federal funding is playing, it's still a very significant element of investment in transportation infrastructure, but it's playing a less important role in that area. So what are the key elements of what I've described as a paradigm shift in federal transportation policy? What are the trend lines of the policies that are emerging? Well, first of all, as federal transportation funding stagnates or even declines, as it is doing in real terms, the roles of states and localities in this area have increased, despite their own very severe budget and fiscal challenges. Second, at the federal level and in many states and localities, there seems to be a gradual shift away from user-based support for investment in transportation infrastructure. There are several important reforms in MAP 21, despite the leveling of the funding, that have demonstrated a response to the need and demand for more effective and accountable investments of federal funds in transportation projects. Program consolidation and simplification, particularly in the highway arena. Increased emphasis on asset management and state of good repair. And the introduction of performance management principles in surface transportation programs and an emphasis on performance, measurement, outcomes, and accountability. There seems to be a steady shift away from federal funding to federal financing to backstop revenue streams that are created at the state and local level for investment in projects. And I think that's a growing trend. We do have some significant challenges before us. What is the role of the federal government? A clearer definition, and perhaps a narrower definition than has been the case for the last half century, of the federal role in surface transportation. Second, achieving broad acceptance for funding for transportation infrastructure at all levels. Funding for transportation is really a form of investment. The sources of investment need to be equally long-term and sustainable. We need to make better and wiser choices and decisions about the transportation projects and programs in which we invest scarce capital resources. This requires a fundamental reform, in my view, of the transportation planning and capital programming processes and institutions at all levels of government. And we need to have broad and comprehensive strategic capital and operating programs in which investments of constrained resources are targeted on those projects and programs that bring the greatest economic, social, and environmental benefits and returns.